All right, so engineering ethics is, a very general topic. We have ethics in all forms of engineering. What we're going to look at is how it applies to computer security, and in particular, computer security research, I should call this, right? So if you're looking at computer systems, you're looking at the security of them, how do ethical principles apply to that research, and how should you proceed with some of this work? And in particular, I'm going to show you a few examples in Canada and even locally where people can get into trouble, with the law, despite potentially fulfilling what would seem to be, the ethical requirement. So we'll talk a bit about a whole range of areas on the general topic of computer security research. There's a lot more here. Of course, none of this is going to be any sort of legal opinion about it. I'm just going to kind of highlight some sort of generic stuff around this. So obviously, if you're involved in this work yourself and you're concerned about something, you should get actual competent legal advice about the topic. So basically, the fundamentals of computer security research, we can tie back to just general engineering ethics. So I've copied here the professional engineering ethics because in Canada, you may want to register as a professional engineer. If so, right, they have their own code of ethics, but it follows in general with what you'd be expected as an engineering professional. And the number one thing is always that the safety, health, and welfare of the public is the most important consideration. And what we're going to see is that this actually can be a bit tricky because other things, other laws, other contracts may actually impact your ability to keep the public as safe as possible. And there might be some opinions about, well, is it a big deal or not? And I'll highlight a few examples where this has actually come out before. But in general, the driving force should always really be to help keep the public safe. So some of these security threats could actually impact public safety, right? And this is where it gets really important. The other thing that I like to highlight, right, is the next two is that performing services only in their area of competence. So that doesn't mean you're not allowed to learn new things. It doesn't mean you can't explore new areas. What this means is that if you're representing yourself as an expert in a particular topic, it should be an area that you, in fact, are an expert in and you have that competency in, right? So there's a really serious risk here in general in engineering if you claim to have expertise in something. If someone asked you to design a high voltage system and you've never done that before, and you aren't familiar with the safety requirements and the standards, right, you're not going to design a safe high voltage system, for example. In a similar way, if you're being asked to do a security audit, right, and you've never done this before, but you claim that you'll give an expert report on this, this is a problem because someone could be making decisions based on your claim that you can, in fact, definitively say a device is secure or not. So this is why we have this, this consideration in here. The other thing that to me is a bit related, right, is that if you have a public statement, it should be objective and truthful, right? So objective means that you're not trying to fan the flames to make a really big news article that makes you look super cool because you're claiming that you can hack everything, right? So this will be a really important thing when we talk about disclosing security bugs, because you want to make sure it's objective. You want to make sure that it accurately covers the work you've done. If you're doing work under a contract, right, and so this could vary a bit, the idea is that you should be performing that work in a faithful way. So if someone's hiring you to do a security audit, right, you shouldn't be using that information and leaking it to someone else. You shouldn't be later using that information for some other, work that was not specifically allowed. If you do some of this work, if you're paid to do some security research, right, it might be that the results of this, the report, is confidential and owned by the company. So you can't talk about it, right? And that's something that is going to come up quite a bit, whether or not you're allowed to disclose it to other people or not. So luckily in a lot of security research, it's become more common that you are allowed to do that, but that would have to be spelled out in any sort of contract. Avoiding deceptive acts, right? So this again goes back to avoiding, even if you think perhaps legally there's some way to do this. If you're performing some security research work, you should be very upfront about if there are considerations or restrictions on how the attack could be performed. So you're not trying to say this attack is applicable in every case, but you're very upfront. And again, this goes back to being objective and truthful, upfront about how the attacks work in practice. And of course, the final one. So this is kind of a catch-all they have, right? Conduct yourselves honorably, responsibly, etc. So I think that the others really detail, a lot more about this. But as a catch-all, right, there's going to be some level of what is a responsible thing to do here, what is ethical. So this is sort of a catch-all for that. Obviously, you would be expecting to do this work if you're doing any sort of computer security. So this last one shouldn't be a surprise. I think it's really those first three that'll define a lot of what we're going to talk about when it comes to computer security research. And the one thing I want to point out in this, right, is that you notice the order of these. The safety of the public is always going to be the most critical. And this, in fact, may conflict with laws. It may conflict with commitment you've made to commercial entities if you discover some critical bug. And this becomes a very, very, very hard thing to figure out what the correct answer is, because you could be like, someone like Edward Snowden that was, in fact, part of a government entity that was doing things he felt was unethical. And it becomes a big question because it's a little bit of an opinion. Is the public being hurt, etc. And there will be legal repercussions for this. So this is where it gets very tricky, is that it's not always cut and dry, especially in security, where there could be some negative side effects to disclosing problems. So this is where, ethics doesn't stay as a black and white thing to discuss. Okay, so example number one, electronic car lock. So electronic car locks this is sort of an intro to what happens when you try to disclose. So some researchers basically were looking at publishing some information on the immobilizer design and how it could be bypassed. Why would you want to publish that, right? It seems like, well, maybe criminals want that. But most likely for a lot of this stuff, people might know about the flaw already. So by publishing it, it's actually showing the public what the issue is, and it's pushing the companies to fix the issues. So a lot of the disclosure is about forcing companies to fix the issues that they might not otherwise fix. And so much of what we do is actually going to be, and again, this goes back to the safety of the public. So yes, it's going to cause some loss for companies. They have to develop new algorithms. They might have to do, a recall or something. But if this issue is out there, right, shouldn't the public know about the potential security flaws? And so a lot of what we're going to talk about is the pushing out of disclosures around security flaws and what that has resulted in. Now here's one of my favorite examples. Building on that, so with this, the one thing, is after they tried to publish it, there was a 2-year injunction. So basically Volkswagen stopped them from publishing it for some time. So this is the risk of, if you are publishing it in this way, they basically discussed the bug with Volkswagen, told Volkswagen about the bug, and Volkswagen tried to stop them from publishing for some time. So if we talk to the company, this could happen depending a bit on the bug, right? So this was a bit of a risk. In this case, what is the risk to the public? It's a bit more vague, right? It's not as there's an immediate risk. Here's another example where there was potentially a much larger risk to the public, and it changed how the disclosure happened. And from this side, right, if you're this medical device company, St. Jude Medical, they have tons of revenue. So in 2014, the revenue is $5.6 billion. And they make products like pacemakers. So this is implanted in your chest, right? So that goes in your chest there. And you have different stuff that can talk to the devices that go in your home. And they make a whole bunch of different medical devices. But of importance, they make a number of, super critical, people can die if this goes wrong type devices. And the fact that you can communicate with them, right, adds some interesting stuff here because it means that maybe there's a way someone else could talk to the device. How secure are they and things like that. A bit of a backstory here was that the company itself had some things disclosed to it starting in 2013. I never actually found details. So I found details of that. So I can't confirm, but as an example, there was who is St. Jude? They were also hit with a lawsuit, for example, that they knew some of the pacemakers had issues with battery life, right? So between 2011 and 2015, there was actually a recall on this specific issue, right? So, and it can cause a very serious battery life failure. And there was a lawsuit because it's claimed that they actually knew about this problem for longer than they didn't immediately try to solve the problem, in a responsible way. They pushed a lot of this onto insurance companies to do replacements and stuff like that. So a lot of these medical companies are fairly revenue focused. This is a very important lens to look through when we're discussing what happened next. So if you disclose, right, if this company is purposely, even for like serious issues like the battery, trying to prevent, additional costs to them, what happens if there's security issues? And you, as a researcher, disclose that to them. The company doesn't have a real disclosure process. There's no fix that's being discussed at this point, and it could actually impact customers. There's critical flaws that could impact customers. What do you do next, right? So if the company's not responsive, what do you do next? So this is a pretty interesting solution to the problem. Is the researchers actually did a stock shorting, which is that you can make money off the stock if it falls, right? So if you expect a stock is going to fall, you can short it and then make some money off this price difference. If the stock goes up, that's very bad because you lose money yourself. But if you have, if you think something is going to happen to the stock, you can short it to make money off that fall. So in this case, what happened is that a hedge fund shorted the stock, and that means that they thought the price was going to fall, but they also released a number of vulnerabilities. So there's a report showing some of these security issues at the same time of this, and they basically forced this to become a financial issue for St. Jude. So if it was purely a security issue, they may not have cared. If it's a financial issue, well, this changes things. This is, way outside of the normal framework of disclosure. So this is a good example, though, where it's in a service to the public area because, if you have potentially these security flaws, at the time, there's pretty limited rules around medical device security. Some of that's changed, so you luckily shouldn't have to do that now. The FDA has processes to disclose security flaws. But at the time, it was pretty limited. So this was sort of a solution. It affected the company greatly. It also made money. So this is where it became a bit more of an ethical, black and white, or not black and white thing, right? Is that the researchers use this as a way to raise funds as well. So it's a very interesting case. It's very outside of a straightforward disclosure process. And it's also a bit better indicative of when you're looking at devices, things are not always going to be so straightforward. But let's assume first that it is. How should this work? Right? So the normal process we have, if you had a security flaw you found in a device, is that you tell the affected party, normally this is a company, about the issue. And you tell them quietly, giving them time to fix the problem. And the normal result of this is that after they fix it, you can discuss with the world what this problem was. And the idea of discussing it is that so people can understand, it might not just be the one company that has this issue. There might be many companies that have this issue. And there might be other companies that have related issues. So by discussing it publicly, more people can fix these problems and, more importantly, not make the same mistake in the future. And And so this is basically what a lot of security research is built on, is this entire idea: we find problems in real life, we fix them in real life, we wait a bit, and then we publish openly so that they aren't made again in related areas. And because of this, most companies, so here's Google's application security page, and if you Google most companies plus security, you'll find one of these pages. And it basically says, if you have a security vulnerability, you can tell us about it, and we have some system to report it so that you know how long you have to wait and things like that. There's normally, so this has two conflicting sides, right? So you have the company side. The company doesn't want anyone to know about the issue. They want everyone to think they're super secure. And there's you as the security researcher who probably wants to talk about this. So this is the sort of issue that you're going to have. The company, would prefer that no one knows they had a security issue, and you want recognition. Normally is the two sort of main conflicting things. The kind of standard, I'd say, is about 90 days. This is, 3 months. Normally this is enough time to figure out the problem, fix it, deploy it, and then you can talk about it. At least for software, so this gets more complicated with hardware. Sometimes it's much shorter timelines. There's been times where fixes are pushed out in days and then people are talking about it. It varies quite a bit. Once you start fixing the problems, it often tips off other people to the existence of the bugs too. So there's lots of people that look for changes in applications and in items to figure out security flaws. Now this gets a lot tricky. This assumes everything worked really nicely. They agreed. What if they don't agree to the disclosure? So they just say, no, we never want you to tell anyone. This is often where injunctions or lawsuits get involved. What if the timeline is years, right? Or the device can never be fixed? So this typically kind of loops back into this. And what if the company, because of the above, sues you, threatens injunctions, all sorts of stuff. So this is where things get, again, more complicated. And this is where we've ended up in real life. There's many examples of this. Managing it is basically looking at the company side concern. So often some of this disclosure kind of fouls up because the researcher side only wants to publish the work very, very openly. And the company may have concerns about this initial approach. And because of this, there's going to be some ways that companies have started to standardize it. But if you're doing, the research yourself, you always have to consider, how will this work? When I approach the company, what will they do? And the company will normally ask, why did you do the work? So is this just something you did for fun and you want to talk about? So you probably want something out of it, right? Do they want like fame from the work, if not part of some paid engagement? In which case they're going to want to very openly talk about it. And what do they want for us, right? So are they trying to get money out of us? This is a pretty common one, and this can take many forms. The sort of most common result of this, or a common result of this, is if the company doesn't want your information public, right, rather than suing you, they may offer to say, well, what if you did this as part of a paid engagement? And if it's part of a paid engagement, you typically aren't going to talk publicly about it, or they're going to have very strict control over how you can talk about it. So it might be that the money is just sort of, is something that gives them a useful result, which is this paid report. The other question is going to be, well, is it closer to extortion, right? So is it extortion or is it research? If it's an interesting result, the results are applicable to them, it's written objectively, it's probably going to fall under research. If you say, unless you pay me $10,000 for this report, or I'm going to go talk to the news and I'm going to say you're terrible and you're really hackable, this is basically extortion at this point, right? So this is the difference here. And this again goes back to when we talked about the ethics. If any public statement should be objective, should be truthful. So if you're just saying company XYZ is super hackable, well, that's not objective, right? That's not truthful. You haven't tempered what the true results you found are. Probably there's a lot of conditions around it, and you shouldn't just be trying to make a big news story out of it. The other thing the company is going to be interested in is how flexible you are in your publication plans. If you plan on publishing this, so a lot of research, when you tell the company you don't want any money out of it, especially if this is more academic research, you're not going to have any of those results. Your goal is to publish a paper out of it. And the question is, how flexible are you? You know, do you want to publish this in a conference a month from now, 2 months from now, a year from now? Have you already submitted it somewhere? So there's some flexibility that they're also going to be curious about. If the end result of this is a sort of consultancy agreement, basically what this means is it's as if the company said, hey, you did this great work. What if we just said we hired you to do this? And it's going to fall under all the sort of standard provisions of a consultant contractor type agreement. If you're an independent security researcher, so if you're not affiliated with someone, this would be a pretty common end result here. So here's an example, right, of a disclosure I did. And this was for a paper that is in event SCAR in November. And basically, so last year in 2019, I reached out to them. There's normally some product security incident response. So you find this security incident response email. I have a short summary of what the issue is. They want to know, should this reach? Who should this, what group within the company? So it's a huge company. I'm looking at a specific chip. I give them a short summary to make sure it gets directed to the correct area. In this case, there wasn't a full report yet. So this was a really early. I prefer to talk to people as early as possible, just to give them the heads up about what's happening. So I had sort of a demo video with some more details. So I just linked them that and said, here's an example of running the particular attack I'm talking about, and so that they can know it's not just made up. I also discussed about where I'd like to go with it. So publishing a paper. At this point, it wasn't clear. Again, this was very early. This was just proving it's possible. And part of the reason that it was sort of like a year before I actually ended up publishing it is because this was pre having a finished research report. The final thing that I like to do is, make a note. So in this case, as I said, one of the concerns is always going to be, are they going to try to sort of make this out to be some huge thing? Is to have an explicit statement about, this being reasonably well-tempered in terms of the discussions around this are not going to try to say this is a specific, you guys did a bad job. Often these things are very industry-wide issues, right? So maybe some bugs you run across are really bad. This was not one of those. This was a classic case where it's very standard across the industry. I happen to find one particular vulnerability on one particular device, but it's hardly worth trying to point out the company as being the issue here. What I'm trying to get here eventually is some permission to publish this this research, right? This is pretty common. What happens next? So the company I contact, they know this industry the best. They know the automotive industry. They know what their customers are doing, what their customers' concerns are. And they will have some questions about, did you try X, Y, Z? What sort of scenarios did this work in? And so there's some additional discussions, some additional experiments that happened before sort of a final version of the paper was sent to them for feedback. And in this case, it was very limited adjustments to this. It was basically okay as is. So there's no official agreement here, right? There's no contract. There's nothing that prevents me from publishing it. But often companies may have some feedback that's often very valid. So another example was there's some work I did on the Atmel SAML11. They had some really good feedback about, well, here's how we see people are going to interpret section 123, which is different from what I would interpret it as in the security space. So it's good feedback to adjust it because if this report is going out to a wider audience, we want to make sure it's accurate to everyone. And the results of this basically is a paper presentation, as I previously discussed. So if you have another, bugs, you might also find bug bounties being available. So these offer you rewards for the disclosure. They vary greatly. So there's a company called HackerOne that has like a whole bunch of bug bounties that they run for companies. If you look at specific ones, so someone like Apple has, bug bounties in theory up to $1 million. So there can be some pretty serious bug bounties available for some of this work for you. The only thing I'll mention is a lot of these don't cover hardware. So what we're going to talk about in this class often aren't covered under some of these bug bounty disclosures. And sorry, my screen's going crazy here. I don't know why, but anyway. And one of the issues that is still a little bit being worked out through is what is the value of an exploit and is the bug bounty reasonable? So phone security bypasses in particular are highly, highly sought after by law enforcement. So if you have stuff about phone security or even computer security, right, there's a lot of law enforcement in different countries would love to get that because they want to get access to phones that, they confiscate someone's phone, but it's encrypted, it's protected by a password. They need to get into it to collect evidence. So for example, for the one of the cases in the US fairly recently, they unlocked a very specific iPhone, so the shooter's iPhone, which was this 5C model, and they paid around, it says now a little under $1 million, but probably somewhere around that for the bypass. So the question is, is the value that Apple is going to offer you enough that it makes it worth telling the bug to Apple versus telling, selling to the FBI? So there's a whole market in these sort of exploits. All right, so again, if you're choosing the path, really what you should always look at is the sort of ethical duties in determining the path. So I bring these up again, where the safety, health, and welfare of the public is always going to be the most important consideration here. The disclosures also need to be realistic and accurate. So this really falls into the second point, right? Which is that if it's a public statement, if the disclosure is going to be public, which like a paper is also a public statement, right? Even if you don't consider that the same as going to the news or something like that, really it is a similar public statement. So it should be objective and truthful, right? So a common example of this, if we're looking at like IoT door locks and stuff, right? You might have a bug that says, hey, if you remove the back of the lock, there's some test pads, you access the test pads, blah, 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 you can unlock the door. Which sounds really scary, but it's also, if someone can access the back of the lock, is that actually a security concern? Probably not. General engineering ethics also apply, as I said, to computer security research. And the number one thing is that safety of public. The issue you're going to run into is you may or may not actually have permission. If you decide to disclose without permission, you're going to have to weigh a lot of different things around the safety of the public. And the computer security laws are still changing frequently, so they haven't fully caught up with where that is. The DMCA is probably the most well-known, right? So this is a US law, and this basically made it illegal to circumvent what we would call digital lock, but if you circumvent measures that control access to copyright works, it becomes an act illegal itself. So just breaking the lock was illegal, regardless of what that lock's protecting. This was a huge issue, so there's now some, exemptions that have been added because, well, what if you're just repairing a device? You're allowed to repair your own device that you own, but what if they put a digital lock on that? So all of a sudden you can't, touch your car because it's protected by a digital lock, even though you're legally allowed to repair your car. So a lot of these exemptions have been added, but there's still, some corner cases here, and it still can be a risk. Security research itself has been exempted from a lot of this, not everything. And so if you're dealing with any sort of device that has a digital lock, right, it's important to understand what the restrictions are. Now, we're not actually in the US, right? So even though DMCA is the one that you might have heard about and gets the most press, it's not technically the most relevant to you. You have to be careful because if you go to the US, you're also subject to the DMCA. So you can still get in trouble for provisions of the DMCA. But the basic, so the Canadian Bill C-11 is a similar act, a Copyright Modernization Act. It has basically breaking digital locks becomes an issue. And the only caveat is that there is two different, so there's two, let's just restart this to get rid of our ink issue. There's two different considerations for security and encryption research. And so both of these, they just have slight variations. But the basic idea is that if you're doing research where you're going to disclose to the company, you typically get exempted from a lot of this. And what we have here is that and so there's an interesting paragraph at the end of both of these. So this paragraph here I've blown up because it basically says, if you give adequate notice, so the problem you're going to immediately see is it says if you give adequate notice, is the words I'm looking for here, you will get exempted from a law. It's basically allowed. It does not become illegal. So remember, we're talking about stuff that's illegal for breaking the digital locks on these systems. But what is adequate notice? That's a good question. The other thing is, right, if the public interest in having the vulnerability or security flaw without adequate notice outweighs the owner's interest in receiving that notice. So basically, if there's a security flaw that the public should know about and you don't have time to tell the owner, there's this exemption in here. But you are basically going to become a test case for defining what was the owner's interest and what was the public interest. So this is the problem with these rules, is that it's not clear, right? And we may have very different ideas of what the public interest versus the owner's interest is. The other caveat is that network security testing is another type of security testing, right? So in general, we've looked at devices you own. Network security testing is even trickier because it's typically a device you don't own. In general, the statement that if it's a device that's not your own, you can get in a lot of trouble, right? So if it's another network and you don't have permission to run these tests, even if you have permission to be on it. So there's a number of laws beyond just those copyright laws related to accessing computer systems beyond your permissions that are going to get you in a lot of trouble. Embarrassing governments also gets you in a lot of trouble. So this is a local example if you haven't heard about it. There was someone who basically found a very simple attack on, I say attack, pretty vaguely, on one of the Nova Scotia government websites where all you did was the number, so the ID number of the document you could change and then you could download it. It didn't actually authorize who was allowed to download it or not, right? It had a nearly identical URL, so there's no login, there's nothing. It's very vague if this counts as hacking. In the end, it was dropped, but this person went through a lot of hassle, more or less because they embarrassed the government. So this is the one caveat, and this isn't the first case at all. In Canada, another case recently, when the Heartbleed bug came out, so I guess this was 2014, so a little while ago now. When the Heartbleed bug came out, they basically, someone ran a test on the CRA website, and eventually he pled guilty, right? So let me blow up these quotes here. So he was a computer science student at Western University, or was when this case pleaded out. But originally they were trying to charge him with a whole bunch of charges that were up to like 10 years in prison. And he ended up with a conditional sentence, so he wouldn't have any jail time. But to give you an idea of who this person is, right? He had 20 reference letters from everyone basically saying, he was not a hacker, troll guy. He was just a curious guy who ran an interesting test on a website that basically wasn't very secure. And he never tried to make money off any of this, and he was just trying to explore some of these items. So that was sort of the risk that you have, right? So the safety of public is the most important consideration. You might still have a lot of legal trouble for trying to keep public safe. And the intent here matters. So what I showed you before, right, is that even with nice intent, it still can be a bit of a problem. Access to devices you don't have permission is almost always against the law and almost always going to cause you trouble. So that's kind of a quick summary of ethics in computer security. So hopefully, I know there's a lot more to this. Hopefully this covered some interesting topics for you and gave you some more cases that you can take a look at.